There, now
Yeah.
I see the live thing. Hey,
Way to
everybody.
start it.
I'm great with introductions. We're the Wandering Pilgrims, and we haven't a clue. But we're sure having fun not having a clue and trying to, talk like we know something. So this is our show for the night. We got David, Justin, Matthew, and I think Johnny was there in the background somewhere. I'll probably be here for most of the time. Of course, I'm your not-so-humble host, Eric, who probably should be humbler. I'm not really sure so much what we're going to talk about tonight. I think we have a lot of... Epistemology's really been driving me nuts lately because I've been getting into a lot of conversations online where people are just making these bald assertions, and it's like, come on, guys, where are you standing? So that's one thing. We had mentioned movies, the Trinity, and things like that, and I think we're going to hold off on that. But for tonight, I think it's... I don't want to call it a free-for-all because we definitely have a focus. I can sense the focus. It's just we don't know what to call it.
It's an organic conversation in progress.
Exactly.
And I've got myself a tall glass of iced tea, and I'm ready to talk about some happy theology.
Hell yeah. So, David, you were starting with something there. You had a few ideas that you wanted to talk about. You want to go with it?
Oh, well, I've not been a part of, the last one or two of these, and I've not watched all of those hours of discussion, but I did have a few thoughts, but most of them fit under some of the other future subjects that we'll touch on again. So I might reserve most of those. Like one of the questions that came up in the beginning of, I think Justin brought this up, was, without God, what basis is there for ethics? But I feel like that's probably a subject we'll come back to another time. We haven't had a broadcast that's dedicated to the subject of ethics, and I feel like I have a reply to that, but I feel like I can wait until that discussion comes up. There was also a question on what is meaning. Philosophically speaking, how do we define meaning? What is meaning? Where does it come from? And I have a reply to that too, and I don't know, maybe that fits best in this sort of mishmash of a discussion now.
You got my antennas up. I want to hear your response about meaning.
Yeah, that's interesting to me.
Okay, now I have to admit, I've not gone back and reread. So I listened to that broadcast, and then I got my head in the space and I paused it, and then I wrote out a response, and I've not gone back and memorized the argumentation or anything. So I'm just going to read back what I wrote down extempore in response to the video as it came to me. So it's not been edited. So it's basically exactly what I would have said. It's just written down. So basically, the question was, what is meaning? And so first, you guys are familiar more or less with my sort of metaphysical approach, which actually is representative of my ontogony. So I've mentioned that 0, 1, 2, 3 process, that argumentation, right? Do I need to cover that again?
I think just because you brought up the word ontogeny, and I had never heard of that word before yesterday, so I'm sure there's plenty of other people who haven't. You might want to explain that a little bit.
Well,
ontogeny is a fun-sounding word. I would like to know what this means.
Holy cow, Matthew doesn't even know what the word means. You found a word that Matthew doesn't know. You win the interwebs for a night.
This is new. This is fantasy for me. I need to know, what is ontogeny? I need to find a new word to use in everyday conversation.
Yes.
We're talking word porn here. We found Matthew's addiction.
Oh, yes, I'm addicted to words. Use it every day, shoot it up, Had some logos
sick
today.
Little puppy. All right, David. So what is ontogeny?
You can snort it. You can shoot it.
Well, ontogeny. Now, I actually just started a Google search to pick apart the etymology of it. Onto clearly is referring to being. The G-O-N, I don't recall, but I know that it has something to do with origins, so far as the etymology is concerned. But basically, the concept of an ontogeny is a very ancient practice. So an ontogeny would refer to, this is a term that you'll be more likely to encounter when you're dealing with ancient religions and with the historical research or literary research involved in, say, for example, some of the ancient Near East mythologies. So an ontology in that context is the origin story of the gods. So you can say that when you have heard the story of how Zeus and the other gods were created, by they were the children of the Titans and all this other stuff, and then the Titans were the children of Kronos and Gaia or whatever, right? That is an ontogony. Now that's an ontogony of finite gods. But so the question is it possible to have an ontogeny of an infinite God that doesn't have a beginning? So then the application of that term to the concept of an infinite God, a God without a beginning, is just trying to understand what are the logical first principles of a God, which actually also means the logical first principles of being itself, since God is at the root of all that is. So that's what ontogeny stands for.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. I just, when I first saw the word, because I had seen it in a word before, I figured that might be the case. But, words are mysterious things, and they like to change meanings. But, yeah, that's definitely a fun word, and it's an interesting topic for me, actually.
Well, I very much like the fact that you went to the etymology of the word first.
Love
because,
etymology.
the ontos
You get points.
Ontos and logos are the two roots, I do believe, and I think that we full know well what those two words mean.
Right.
It's just I've just never heard them both put together, and it's a compelling thing. I had a gut reaction when you were talking about how, and I don't want to articulate it too much myself because I'm not even sure that I understand what you were saying. But talking about now we're talking about a logical progression, not a temporal progression, obviously, because God isn't subject to time. So when you're talking about him knowing himself by dividing himself into two opposite principles. At first, it sounds to me almost like Gnosticism, actually, about wisdom giving birth with no consort and giving birth to Yabioth, the bastard demigod and all that. It bears a passing resemblance to it. You know what I mean? So, of course, I had a knee-jerk reaction to it, but this has been like probably the number one thing that has been occupying my theological mind lately is how mathematical we're trying to make God, yet math has no personality, and God very much has a personality. He has volition. He has volition that's not necessitated by mathematical principles. He has feelings, wants, desires. He's a personal God, and I just can't make that make sense in my mind. And so when you bring up ontogeny the other day, that's almost like a psychology of God, maybe. So
it's something like that.
Very, very fascinating to me. So
It is fascinating. It's been something that's been on my mind as well, like off and on. It's one of the big kind of criticisms I have with some of my friends in idealism is their tendency to pigeonhole like the ontology of God in the realm of just like information being brutally conscious. I mean, it is kind of an undercurrent idea in some of it. Justin, you would know, like some of the criticisms that have been going on there. And so the idea of like God, the psychology of God is definitely of interest to me, especially taking in, in things like simplicity. And like Eric brings up, things like personality, feelings, volition, and all of that. That's also something I've been trying to think about in the mind of impassibility, because like, where does, like, the question comes to mind, like, from where does God act and from where does God feel? And like, from
whence,
where
you
does
mean?
God
From whence?
experience? And are these things divided? Like, how does the psychology work beyond the temporal progression of things, of events that are taken into account?
You know what, guys? I confused the word ontogeny. It's very closely related. Clearly, it means the origin of being.
Mm-hmm.
Theogony is technically the word that I intended, the origin of God. Just
I think
clarification.
I think that regarding like classical theism or theism in general, where God is grounded being, those two become synonymous.
Yeah, I was
Right.
just about to say that there's quite an overlap between those two.
I mean, like you said, the cosmogonies and the theogonies, in the Greek myths regarding the finite gods, that makes sense. But like regarding the origin of Deus, I mean, yeah, ontos and theos become basically the same word. So
this is the thing that I struggle with lately. When you put Neoplatonism and idealism of any sort and just sheer logical processes, when you put those juxtaposed to experience, to relationship and things like that, it's almost like the substance relation problem. That's why I'm a substance monist, because I can't see an interaction between two different substances, and it seems like that's what I'm seeing with God, is that there is personality to him, but there's also just sheer being and logic to him as well. And I'm having a hard time reconciling those two and finding a way that they can be found in one another.
Well,
Wait, what?
so in my case, and you guys kind of are getting a picture of the way that I approach things. But for me, so I have this metaphysical system which includes a theogony. But when I put forth those ideas, I'm not saying this is the way things are. So the classical thing is you come up with a system or whatever, and then you put it forth as an explanation for how things are. And it's quite a definitive statement you're making. For me, that's not what it is. My system, I have a system, I built a system, I like my system, I think my system makes sense, but I don't really want a rational system. What I want is a reason to believe there could be an ultimate rational system under reality. So I may not have it pinned, but I want I want my own way of understanding, of languaging reality that makes sense to me, that gives me a comfort with the concept that there is an ultimate reality, an ultimate system, a logos.
You're wanting a navigation system. A way of navigating reality, as it were.
Yeah, so basically even the construction of my metaphysics is existential. The method of my approach to systematizing a philosophy and a theology is completely existential.
Mm-hmm.
Well, isn't it all a means unto an end? I mean, isn't it really all about knowing in the proper sense, not knowing in an intellectual sense or knowing information, but knowing in the sense of a husband knowing his wife, of knowing relationship, of knowing, that actual experience? Because I long time ago realized that my brain isn't big enough to hold such a truth as God. I can apprehend that truth. I can have metaphors of that truth that sink in as reality to me. But really, the knowing can't be contained with meat. It's like Matthew calls it, the nous. There's a knowing that goes beyond cognition, that goes beyond simple experience, and that's what I want to lay hold of. And that's the point of any theological endeavor for me. Is I like the knowing, I like the intellectual knowledge part of it, and having a theological system, but like Paul says, I count all of that rubbish compared to knowing Christ himself.
Even Thomas Aquinas, according to tradition, he had a spiritual experience, and after that spiritual experience, he looked at the Summa, like all of his work, and he was like, "This is so much straw," and I think he actually wanted to burn it, but because it's so much straw, and it's kind of like that. Like I understand what Eric is saying. This is kind of why, like, I like the term veritas, and I use it in a sort of specific sense that is different from the colloquial sense of truth. It's that when we come to know being, it is being, like our being coming into veritas with being itself, that is veritas itself.
Every time someone says,
yeah.
"Oh, go ahead."
But it's like when Pilate asked, "What is truth?" It's like
I was just about
response,
to say that.
Ah.
Every time someone says veritas, I think veritas, veritas, qua est veritas.
And it's like when we ask Pilate's question, we get something of we get the answer, which is, you know, kind of I am, and it's like, aha, this, you know, it's like the Vedantic phrase that thou art. I think, you know,
Yeah.
it's like what is truth? I am that thou art. is the preceding response.
And I love that you just said that, because I think that hits the nail on the head, what I was trying to say earlier. It's like we can read books, we can have discussions, we can paint paintings, write songs, poems, all of that stuff. But the truth can never be encapsulated by any language. It is only encapsulated in the person of Jesus Christ.
We can only that's one of the that's an important metaphysical ground in my vision of iconography, and how idolatry is the probation of that. Is that like with language extends beyond words for me. Is that the philosophy, the art, even the Bible, like things, you know, even, you know, the Bible, which people would consider to be like the Word of God itself, almost, like in the logos sense. These are revealing means, and they're iconography in that sense. They're meant to be a liquid of encounter, almost, like something that we can dissolve in to encounter the truth that is beneath and grounding it, the presence to it. But I think that the idea you bring up, that we can't encapsulate the entire reality of being and truth and all of that into, you know, one of these things so very pigeonholedly. That's where we get into idolatry, and that's something that I think is happening all over the place, even in ways that people don't think about it.
Well, for a long time, I've made a differentiation between the character of God and the essence of God. Like the essence, as in, like, you know, the omni attributes, God's omniscience, omnipresence, and everything. It's like we can't know all that God knows, but we can know the character of God. I used to say nature of God, but I think that might actually, people use that term to describe his omnis and stuff like that. But we can know the love of God and because here's the argument I made. If God can be God and be human, without, like, you know, Jesus wasn't omnipresent, and arguably he wasn't omniscient, then he was love, though. He was justice, truth, peace, mercy, wisdom, and all those attributes, character attributes of God. So to me, that spoke to the fact that the character attributes of God are the most essential, and that is what God essentially is. So that when you know that, you know God, and so the omnis, the omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence, those are like the infinite extension of those character attributes, which are all convertible to each other.
I would just add to that the person, Jesus Christ, didn't have the attributes because he willingly set them aside, but God the Son never ceased being all of that. So,
I would even go further, but I'll let you finish before I go on. Sorry about
well, yeah, all I wanted to say is that in the eternal sense, there's almost a sense in which Christ was observing himself here on earth.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Justin.
God the Son, I guess say the human, Jesus Christ, he was avatar of God the Son.
Yeah, that's the word I like. Avatar. I like that word.
Yeah, I actually. So there's an interesting mystery here of like the union of God and man and Jesus, and like God can't be fully, God in His fullness can't be contained in space and time.
Yeah, it can't be confined, but at the same time, He can manifest locally.
Yeah. So you have to wonder in what sense, because like, okay, so the human and the divine natures of Christ were not separate. They're separate natures, but they weren't like. It wasn't like the human nature was here, but that human nature was not divine. The human nature was also divine.
Oh,
right?
We're assuming the definition of Chalcedon, right?
Yeah, like the two natures united in one person.
Yeah, the hypostatic union.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but we can say that like the human person was not everywhere. So, even though that's true, the human nature was still, the human person was still divine, right? So that's what I'm trying to say is that there's, and I get what you're saying too. Like God the Son was still omnipresent, omniscient, and everything else. But what I'm saying is that it's kind of weird. It's like there's a real sense in which the human person was divine, despite the fact that the human person wasn't everywhere. You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah. I get this geometric picture in my head. I can't remember what the figure's called, but you ever seen one of those tube toruses that's almost turned in on itself? You get at all what I'm saying? It's like you can take a tube torus and you twist it down through itself, and you got like a cup that doesn't have a bottom.
I'm looking it up right now.
I can't think. There's a word for it. There's a geometric shape. It's a very, very popular geometric shape, and that's the way I see the hypostatic union is that.
Let me see if I.
What's that?
Oh wait, no, sorry. I was just going to screen share real quick.
No. Go ahead.
Hold on, just a sec.
Do it.
I'll just finish what I was saying.
You see it?
I see God. Oh wait, do I see?
It's kind of small, but.
Is it like that?
You see it?
Yes. Well, yes. There it is.
Eric, is that what you're talking about?
Fish. It's like a jellyfish.
Okay, just go on.
All this time, God wasn't a flying spaghetti monster. He was the cosmic jellyfish.
I'm sorry, I just got logged out of Hangouts on the phone. I don't know what happened. That's why I cut out like that.
Okay, here, just like, let me do it again. Okay, is this what you're talking about?
No, I saw that. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, I hate it when I do this. Because what I'm trying to think of is,
Sorry.
I see the whole, okay? I see the greater whole, everything, yet I see this focal point. I see both the totality of everything, and yet coming up through that is everything itself localized. And this, I hate how language breaks down because I get so frustrated when I try to talk about this because I see it so clearly in my head and I can't convey it. But I have no problem with God being both infinite and finite at the same time. Like I was talking with Matthew the other day, I see like those Christophanies in the Old Testament, the pre-incarnate appearances of Christ. That was the same body he walked the face of the earth with. I'm certain of that. That was his body. That was his rational, reasonable body. His body had a beginning when he was born in Mary, but once he ascended, time was no longer an issue. And I see God as being one big circle, and the incarnation is the point where that pen hit the paper to draw the circle, but the circle continually goes back on itself. It has no beginning or no end.
Okay, look at my screen now. Is this what you're talking about?
It's very similar. I'll find it. I'll find what I'm talking about. But you guys go ahead. I gotta take care of some technical stuff because I got logged off of the phone. So I'll be back.
Okay.
I have the incarnation is one of my areas of thinking. Like it is omnipresent throughout a lot of my stuff. Like it is my Christianity in so much of it. I mean, but the interesting thing that that came to mind was the idea of participation when Justin was talking about God and the character of God in Christ, even though Christ did not express, bodily omnipresence, as it were. The human nature of Christ participates in the divine nature. And in that respect, the human nature does express the character of the divine nature, being loving, and etc., in the immanent fashion that it does, because the body is immanent, whereas the transcendent God is transcendent, such that God is also immanent. Immanence is kind of almost an effect of transcendence. So the human nature participating in the divine nature of the Son, united in that one person that is that one person, being both immanent and participating within itself as as the begotten creature. That's where you get that's where you get the both-andedness of the omnipresence of the Son and the divine nature with the localized immanence of the human nature, including in both things of knowledge, and this is due to simplicity. The presence of God is also the knowledge of God. So the omnipresence, the omniscience of God is participated in locally by the human nature participating in that. So that's how you get both the emptying in the immanence and just the eternal givenness of the glory of God at once within that mystery.
I just realized something. When I was separating out different kinds of attributes, where what I call character attributes and essential attributes, due to divine simplicity, God's love and justice and all that are convertible with omnipotence and omnipresence and all that. So for instance, you say God's love and justice are convertible with this omnipotence, because in a sense you say God's love is pure, God's love is God's justice is pure and all that, and that's in a certain sense you see that's how He is omnipotent. And so I realized then that really we have to define this instead of looking at this as sort of God physics, where what is the physics of God? Kind of like what David always kind of goes back to is God's self. It's rooted in God's will. He self-limits, and that's where it comes from. He just decides to do it. So that's what the heck? Are you gargling?
Oh,
someone washing their mouth?
Yeah.
Didn't realize my mic was still on. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Amy's cracking up right now. Anyway.
That's so funny.
Welcome to the Wandering Pilgrims. We are real and we are live. Bloopers and all.
I gargle. I swish. That's what you were just talking about is what I was mentioning earlier, how it seems like we keep reducing God to mathematics, and I can't help but think that we're seriously missing something in that process.
That's pure will.
Even as a Platonist, mathematical Platonist, I hold to divine conceptualism, which is mathematics and logic and all that. You can't have quantity or the principles behind quantity and the principles behind logical axioms and things like that without to be. I mean, if ontological nihilism were true, then A equals A would not hold. You have to, have to be in order to have, the state of affairs where, one quantity with another quantity equals another, the sum of those quantities, things like that. So I agree with. Sorry about that. What was it?
Oh, sorry. No, I didn't. I thought you were done. So when we talk about the one, we're talking about the ultimate person, right? And God is 1 and 3, and the 3 are persons. So mathematics, it seems to me, kind of come from personhood, from God.
The math seems to come from the unity, as it were.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I'm trying to kind of think through now is with the Trinity and God as the one, is that quantity is accidental to substance.
Mm-hmm.
So my thought is with the Trinity, speculating right now is I don't think that God is dependent on the quantity of 3, or is per se identical to it. And I've been meaning to ask this question somewhere before. I am unsure as to whether or not God is numerically 1 or 3. But those are the only analogies we have to describe what that even is, because God is 1. Like unicity in itself, things like that. But there's also there is a kind of plurality, which, in the Trinitarian doctrine it is, 3 persons, 1 God, and that those persons are only distinct insofar as their relations are distinct. Everything else is effectively the same and identical, which is interesting. So
all right, I want to jump all over this.
I want to say something real quick before you jump, because I just realized something, is that, like, all these concepts of God's attributes are pointing at God, and they're not like, they're as close as we can get. And so 1 and 3 it almost seems like it's pointing to the fact that 1 and 3 are the same, but somehow we get numbers from this one being. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, go ahead, Eric.
So, I think R.C. Sproul did me a lot of favors in this regard, because he does a lot of talk about the Trinity, and to me, I think he's one of the only theologians that I've heard that has actually articulated a rational understanding of the Trinity from a technical standpoint, and that is, God is 1. No matter how you look at it, He is 1, He is unified, He is singular, He is monolithic. However, God's experience, God's expression, God's being can't be pinned down like that from our perspective, simply because we ourselves have this geometric perspective of the world where everything is a shape, everything is distance, everything is relationship as far as the geometry of everything, whereas with God, it's conceptual. It's entirely conceptual. It's not as though God has a body. It's not as though God has any substance as we would count substance. God is. He is isness. And so when you look at the Trinity, what I see is God the Father seeing all things throughout all of eternity, seeing Himself from His perspective and expressing that seeing, that knowing, that understanding as the visible image of the invisible God. What God the Father sees of Himself is expressed in the form of the Son.
Yeah, exactly.
And the relationship between them is mediated by the agency of the Holy Spirit. So what we have is 3 aspects of one God. It's the same God. It's the same. It's a lot like if you were a time traveler. Think about it that way. If you were a time traveler, you could go back in time and make friends with yourself. Well, I'm not dividing time here. I'm dividing reality altogether, and I'm saying that God's experience of reality is multidimensional like that, and his knowing of himself, the knowing of the Father to the Son, is similar to going back in time and knowing yourself. Only it's even a greater dimension than that, because they both have perfect knowledge of one another.
Yeah.
It's like I was talking to Justin, out of springboarding from the earlier argument with the Unitarian that we had, how theism, as far as I was able to run the logic, and with divine simplicity, does render up a kind of Trinitarianism just as a matter of nature, or as a matter of fact. If you take simplicity, and if you take being in itself together, then if it holds that God is able to self-relate in any sense or fashion, which God must obviously be able to self-relate, self-know, be present to himself, then every instance of where God is self-relating does not cease or lose in personhood, because God cannot cease to lose. God cannot cease having or being his own rational nature. God cannot cease being his own personhood. So, if you have any instance where God is self-relating, then that is a personal self-relating on both ends.
Oh, and of course, intrinsic to what I was saying before is that, again, we're talking about a logical construct, not a temporal construct. I'm not talking about God relating to himself in one state as opposed to another state.
Right.
That would do violence to his immutability, of course. Right, exactly. It's a conceptualization tool. It's a metaphor that I think that God can know himself on many different levels, and I think that just like God is bound by things. God's bound by logic, okay? God cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same way. That's not putting limitations on God. That means that God's rational. That means that he's not a good...
I think that I would go even further, and because one thing that I would like to do, since this, sorry for interrupting again, I want to frame this a little bit differently. I want to say not so much that God is bound by logic, as it is that it's kind of a given from God being present to himself.
Well, it's a necessity of existence,
right,
is basically what I'm saying. Oh, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I think that my approach speaks to this pretty ambly. So let me sort of give a preamble to this whole discussion of Trinity and how logic relates to God and that sort of thing. So let me reiterate my whole 1, 2, 3 thing. So this is basically my theogony. I mean, I have other ways of explaining it, but this is a metaphor. Just understand that this is a metaphor. But so the metaphor goes 0. So if we try to think of what would reality be like if there was nothing, very quickly we determine that first of all there isn't nothing. There is something, and we also know from experience that at least if we take causation on faith, that nothing cannot precede something. So 0 just represents the concept that nothing cannot precede something. And so we move on to try to figure out, well, what would reality be like if there was one thing? And when we get there, we find that if there was literally just one thing, if there was what we might call an absolute infinite, an absolute infinite cannot contain quality, is absolutely changeless, is absolutely has no attribute, no aspect. So an absolute cannot have mind, and an absolute infinite cannot create. It's a
Let me just say real quickly that that's
sure.
been that's the heart of what I was trying to get to earlier. That's the heart of my struggle, is that we keep ending up at the absolute, and it's like, where's the heart?
Right.
We rob the heart out of it.
So that's where we move on. So 0 tells us that nothing cannot precede something. 1 tells us that an absolute infinite isn't the solution, because an absolute infinite cannot have mind or quality, and that means even if you aren't theistic, then there can't be anything other than a 1 if there's only 1. It's just 1. It's an infinite, eternal explosion of featurelessness.
It's an inert homogeneity.
Right. So then we move on to 2. So what would reality be like if we have 2? And this is where it starts to get interesting, because what this means then is that the infinite, whatever it is, whatever its nature, self-defines. Because in order to have finition, that is definition, limitation, you have to have something acting on something. And so the only thing in being at this stage in our progression is the infinite itself. And so it has to be acting upon itself in order to even create a second aspect of itself. So the infinite self-defines. And so meaning is the difference between 1 and 2. Okay? Now we move on to 3, because at 2 you can't have mind. If you only have 2 aspects, if you only have 2 things, yeah, what? Oh, okay. She's gonna take a nap. Okay. So anyway, we move on to 3. Now 3 is where life starts. 3 is where mind starts. It's the most basic. It's the fundamental. 3 metaphorically is the most fundamental aspect of being. It's actually 3 in my metaphor actually stands for 3 and more. And so we know that there's clearly
3+.
Yeah, it's 3+. So we know that there are at least 3 things. We know actually from personal experience that there's more, because I have a beard, that's one thing. I have a nose, that's a second thing. Right? There are distinct ideas, and for every single distinct idea, there's a definition, there is meaning, there is delimitation, there is a border, there's a beginning and an ending of something. So this is sort of the way that I approach things, and so this also broaches that question of what is meaning, because for me, meaning can be used as a stand-in for definition, delimitation, that border between one thing and another thing, or that creates significance and semanticy. So meaning then is the difference between 1 and 2. It is a finiteness, and I say this because finiteness always entails relation. And the term meaning entails not merely finiteness, limitation, but whatever relation goes along with that. So then we have to distinguish meaning objectively and meaning subjectively. So meaning objectively is the definition of the object, plain and simple, and as universal as that can possibly be. Meaning subjectively is the definition of the object in the subject, which is really the definition of the subject. In other words, something in me has changed in reflection of the object. And are you guys following me?
Like the experience
that meaning
of the
subjectively
definition.
is that something in me has.
Dude, this is the best discussion on the Trinity I've ever had in my life.
I think
of something that's objective to me changing something in me. If we're going to think about this physically speaking, so in terms of the body and the mind, we would say that there's something in the brain that changes when I see something external to myself. Are you following the metaphor? And so I think that the same thing is happening on a metaphysical level, that something in me has changed in reflection of the object I perceive. And this I both conflate with the object and call its meaning. So I know a rock because not only is the definition of that rock outside of me, that's the objective meaning of the rock, but the definition of that rock is also inside of me. My knowledge of the rock...
The idealists in the room would call this the experience of the definition. I mean,
right.
as it were. So
my knowledge of the rock entails my self-knowledge. Or in other words, my knowledge of the rock entails that I have been changed, that something in me has been defined as the rock, which was not before the rock, and this distinction is subjective meaning. So figurative meaning on the other hand, is the yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say that my good Justin and I, our mutual good friend Matt McTeague, I think is his name, would immediately jump in and point out that this is Thomistic and it's classical, because the classical idea was that our substance was changed by our encounter with knowledge. That the knowledge
Gnostic.
had shaped our substance in some way, because it actually it shapes in our mind and it informs it. It changes its form in some
Yeah,
fashion.
so there's a pattern, a wavelength. So if we're going to think of this in sort of quasi-materialistic terms of idealism, right? So it's wavelengths, right? So there's a wavelength inside of of defined me, whatever I am defined, that resonates with the wavelength of the objective reality of the stone or of another person.
Good stuff.
You guys had me until you started talking about the wavelengths. Like, I think everything that you said.
This is all
David,
metaphor. Yeah.
Oh, I understand.
Well, I think
everything. I think what Matthew was saying is that Micmac would not be speaking in metaphor; that he would be speaking in actualities, and he would be rather Gnostic in his approach to it. To be honest,
I wouldn't say Gnostic, but I would say that he would just point out that he would point it out in Thomistic, scholastic language.
Yeah, maybe, and that's
It's
know
the
him
same
a lot.
stuff at roots.
You know him a lot better than me, so I won't presume to speak to that. All I will say is that everything you were saying, David, is right along the lines of what I was trying to say earlier with my time traveler analogy, only you're far more eloquent with how you put it. It's that self-knowledge of that reaching through eternity to find yourself, that dividing one into two without any real division, just a division of perspective. Maybe that would be a way to say it.
You guys know about Indra's net?
Yes.
Yeah, where basically each node of the system contains the whole system.
Yeah, a hologram.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, basically. The Trinity is a hologram. No.
I'm processing what David was saying
That
through
is
my own
actually is holographic.
through my own metaphysical grid, and the thing that I keep coming up with is the notion that by its very nature, to be, being itself, would have to be self-present. So, I mean, it's kind of like, at no point can to be cease to be self-present. But being self-present and without losing itself in any fashion, it would automatically follow through that, that you would get the kind of implicit morality of relations that come about within to be, just given what to be is, that it is. You get, the kind of you get the kind of happening of to be that thou art. That is happening implicitly within it, eternally, just by its existing, and from that would flow as the fountainhead everything that comes about, with 3+ and more, because even in that zero moment, like, you can't have nothing, and when you have the one, you have, the one self-relating and self-being eternally, so you get the 3 out of it.
Hypothetically, Matthew, sorry, go ahead, Justin.
Oh, I was just gonna say that this is what I was arguing to Aaron Welch, who's a Unitarian, a while back. I'm trying to remember how long ago, this at least a year ago, but I was basically saying, how can God self-know without presenting to himself, and so that's basically like God the Father begot the Son and Holy Spirit and stuff like that.
I swear, I'm not being like romantically gay or anything, but I experience synchronicity with you and Matthew more than any other 2 people on the face of this earth, because I was just thinking, how would an Arian respond to this? And basically, I think Unitarians are basically Arians.
They are. They have to.
So how would an Arian respond to that? I mean, what do you think their mindset would be?
I was discussing this with Justin, actually. Oh, sorry, you go ahead first.
Oh, well, his response was just like, well, how can you put a limitation on God's being able to know himself? Maybe God just knows himself.
Isn't that what they do? I mean,
Yeah.
God can't be a man. It's that simple.
They always
Yeah.
seem to appeal to pious agnosticism.
Exactly.
Or something of that nature, like a pious unknowability.
Hey, you know,
They
maybe
appeal
it's
to the mystery while rejecting the possibility of the Trinity on mysterious grounds.
maybe it's the Fundy in me, but I see all of these various rejections of the truth of God as being various forms of what I was talking about earlier in chat. It is people who are not intellectually opposed to ideas, not rationally convinced otherwise. They're people who have an indignance toward a certain attribute of God, a certain characteristic of God. They are self-righteously indignant towards it, and they hate it. And by extension, have a hatred of God that they might even mask in a form of a love towards God. But ultimately, I think it's all different forms of deicide, deophobia, you know, whatever you want to call it. It's people rejecting God as He presents Himself as He is.
I can see how that might be perceived. I think a lot of it, it's a weave of different motivations because people are animated by motivations. I wonder how much of it isn't a kind of implicit, like sides of a coin thing, is that there is a kind of, at least in my experience, I've noticed is that they really tend to be averse to Western, like European, Greek kind of thinking, you know, anti-Catholic, as just in summary, anti-Catholic, anti-Greek, pagan. And then they veer towards a very, very, like, narrow not even narrow, it's almost like a superficial kind of Hebrewism. Like, they're trying so hard to be Jewish, like in the old way, because they're trying to, and they are motivated with trying to identify with the early, Jerusalem sect, trying to be pure in that Puritan sense, and that's a motivation. But they do so without realizing that, honestly, Judaism, ancient Judaism, at least from what I've looked at, seems to have been very, very, like, it wasn't this great big monolithic, strict Unitarian kind of theism thing. And then as it developed further, it was more Hellenized. And at that point, it was already part of the Western culture, developing philosophical thoughts like that. So
that's definitely what we see when Jesus was walking the earth, is definitely Hellenized Judaism.
I mean, yeah, the Jerusalem sect was...
Well, you had three main sects. You had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. It's Essenes, not Essenes. If I hear someone say Essene one more time, I'm gonna fucking throttle them. But
I like the Essenes.
It's Essene. It's Essene. It's a friggin' anyway, linguistically. So yeah, and the funny thing is, the Essenes are the only ones that aren't talked about in the New Testament, and they were arguably the most influential group of them all. They just weren't as involved in the culture and society, but when it comes down to writings that survived, I mean, they were basically the Gnostic sect. When it comes down to writings that survived, we have far more from the Essenes than we have from any Pharisee or Sadducee writer.
Interesting. Hey, I was going to say...
Oh, sorry, Justin, okay.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, well, it would be obvious to have all the writings, considering most of them lived in the deserts and didn't want to ever do anything but live in the deserts.
Well, yeah, they were kind of exclusivist.
So, that's a great way of preserving your writings when it's dry and untouched by culture and trade.
Yeah, but they also had a huge influence over the shape of Christianity from that point forward. You got to remember, Gnosticism was such a huge influence that John wrote an opposition to it in the Bible. 1 John is basically a response to Gnosticism and the rise of Gnosticism, which was... What's that?
Proto-Gnosticism.
Well, yeah, and it basically came directly out of the Essenes. That they were the Jewish Gnostics of the day. Some people have said that they were the progenitors of Kabbalah as well. But they definitely were the ones that had that Gnostic influence on early Christianity, to the point where, like I said, in 1 John, that whole book is an indictment of Gnosticism and a correction of the errors that it taught.
I was going to say...
Absolutely. Even the the story at the very beginning in chapter 2 of Jesus turning the water into wine is clearly an argument against Gnosticism.
Nice.
If you think about it, I mean,
I never drew that connection. How was that?
Kind of cool.
He said that he sets it up really nicely in chapter 1, of course, like with the prologue and then with John. And then he goes, why does it go straight to this story? And I don't think it's strictly because it's chronological. He didn't have to even include the story in the first place.
Yeah.
What it does is because the Gnostics had this very Greek mentality that there's, a particular kind of Greek mentality.
Yeah.
That the spiritual world is what is good, and the material world is necessarily evil. The problem then that they had as a consequence was that they wanted to reject,
I see where you're going. Yeah, I see where you're going with it.
The rejection of pleasure at all as an evil.
Well,
asceticism.
And the nature of Christ. They had problems with the concept of the deity of Christ being conflated with his humanity because humanity is material. So then, here John comes in, and he basically immediately gives an argument that says Jesus is God, first of all. Secondarily, he is in control of the material world. Mm-hmm. So if the spiritual world, if the very highest spiritual being, if God controls the material world, then the material world itself isn't all that bad. At minimum, it's not all that bad because
kind of like,
the good can control it.
It's kind of like a reaffirmation of the theological point of the Genesis account.
Yeah.
And I would if I were giving a sermon on it, I would even probably point out that Jesus not only controlled the material world, but controlled it with the teleological end that it be enjoyed lavishly. I mean, even after you're drunk off of it, have more. And here's the best of it. So, hey, that has a little bit of stuff for the resurrection too. That's a theologically rich passage. I'll have to really explore that. Thank you for making that connection. That's got a whole lot of meat. My mouth is physically watering because of the theological meat. That happens to me.
You have a complex.
Okay, now's the point where I demand an answer from you guys. You guys have an awful lot to say about the Book of John. How come no one ever says anything in my friggin' study group?
Dude, man. Hey, listen. Sometime let me guys get into why I think that John's prologue deliberately parallels Plato's Cave.
Ooh, that would be...
Whoa, what?
Whoa, what?
I've actually seen I don't remember all of it, but I have seen something on that. John, I recall, I have said it before, is riddled with Platonism. It is beautifully riddled with Platonism.
Yeah,
wow.
It is.
Okay, David?
The darkness hated the light and all that?
Yeah, man.
I believe so, yes.
It makes so much sense. Okay, do you want me to get into it?
Yes.
Okay, let me pull up John chapter 1 here, just so I have a framework to work on in my brain.
I also want to interject something real quick, is that the Gnostics would say that the Logos was I can't remember the term for it right now, but basically they're manifestations of God.
The demiurge?
No, not the demiurge, higher than a demiurge, so like Sophia would be the lowest of, I can't remember the eons. They're basically emanations of the one, and they were all, I guess, I don't remember what the term Logos exactly applied to, but it was higher than a demiurge, so that's what when I was thinking too when David was saying that, is like, well, this is the God coming in control over nature, so, yeah.
Gnostics.
Okay. So all right. So let's jump into it. So what happened?
That was priceless. The best, funniest moments. Think about Steve Carell and his reactions to things, because that was just perfectly what you just did.
I
didn't
remember
get
burp all the time, like really loud.
Oh my gosh.
I missed something.
Even Amy's
me too.
cracking up. I can hear her in the background.
Yeah,
Oh
she
my
burped
gosh.
like really loud. Just
Oh,
go back and watch
We
the video.
love you, Amy. You're one of our favorite people in the world.
All right, go ahead, David.
Is it because I belch?
Hey, God has sustained your ability to belch, therefore it is good. You can take that theology to the bank.
No.
Wow, that sounds like
Okay.
a fortune cookie.
Yeah,
All right,
Delicious.
David, come on, please rescue this conversation, man.
We'll get into
Okay,
the
okay.
telos of farting later.
Yeah. So exactly, and yeah. All right. So we're going to jump into John chapter 1. I'm going to use the NRSV, and I'll have a reason for that actually, because there's a place in particular where it disagrees with the NIV, the RSV, and a large number of the others, but I think that the NRSV actually gets it right. So, in the beginning was the Word, and I hate the translation of there. I really think that we handicap proper understanding of this passage when we translate the word "word." That's really
I agree.
it's a reductionistic translation of it, and
I've
if
spent
you were
so
going,
much time. Sorry, just to interrupt real quickly. I've spent so much time trying to explain to people the biblical concept of what the Logos is. And it's so frustrating when they want to make it that simple English word that's translated word. And that's why I say you can't just rely on translations. But,
And
sorry,
it
go ahead.
meant something deeper then, because you had the whole
Oh, definitely.
context surrounding it in during that time. What has happened is that you've had a degradation of the very word. I mean, over time. It's an unfortunate symptom with our culture today. But
Word.
absolutely. So I think actually, if you were going to translate the term, and you were going to try to keep with a literary term, I would maybe prefer grammar or script, maybe even sentence. All of those I think would be preferable to word. But
or logic.
I mean, logic would be a better term, clearly, as well.
I would say
ultimately-
an articulated truth would be probably the most accurate translation.
I would almost prefer to keep it as logos, just
I
because
do.
that
I
would
do.
compel the research.
Yes. Yeah.
And when you do the research, then you get into the meat. I like the word for its literary value, just because it is pretty. I am a sucker for aesthetics, but I do get David's point on that matter. It is something that unfortunately to people conflating word with Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
where
and
you
I
get
think
the problem.
even the word language would better express the
Language
concept of
would be the best, I think, because then you have all the grammar, the meaning, the definitions, and everything like that. And
So there's a
context.
sense of intentionality. There's intentionality in it. There's meaning in it. There's the idea of expression, etc. So anyway, I'm going to read it as logos. So in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. So let me stop there and reflect on that difference in translation there that I mentioned about the NRSV. So the traditional way of translating verse 3 as it enters into verse 4 is all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing was made that was made. In him was life. And that's where verse 4 begins with in him was life, and verse 3 ends with not one thing was made that was made without him. And the problem with that, which actually a lot of people have called out, but I discovered first in George MacDonald in one of his essays, he points to this as a pleonasm. Why in the world does and I always was uncomfortable with this translation. I always felt like there was something wrong with it. I mean, I remember even as a teenager being confused by why is it so repetitive? All things were made by him. Without him, nothing was made that was made.
McDonald makes a point, like, it doesn't sound like an inspired... He would think that an inspired writer would, you know, have more an eloquent way of putting it.
It seems to me, it seems to me, and this is the way that I've read it for quite some time, that he's straining to make it very clear in a way that cannot be possibly misconstrued that Jesus is the very same God that led them through the wilderness in the wilderness of sin.
I'm going to bring up the passage in Greek just so I have a thing to look at while we're doing
Yeah, go
this.
ahead. So let me give you the alternate translation, which the NRSV has and which MacDonald suggests, and that is that, you know, of course you know that the Greek originally didn't have punctuation and didn't have spaces between words. And so the traditional divisions between the verses is something that we've added to the text subsequently. And in this particular case, the words that end chapter 2 as that was made, what is translated in the usual translations as that was made, is actually still grammatically makes sense as the beginning of verse 4. So it would read this way: all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing was and without him not one thing came into being. Period. Start of a new sentence. What has come into being in him was life. What was made in him was life. And that's the translation that MacDonald recommends, and that's what the NRSV has, and a handful of others. So grammatically, it actually makes sense either way, but so far as narratively, it makes more sense actually that what has come into being in him was life. And there was a time actually, as I understand it, that this change became the former translation. Somebody's got a lot of wind on there. Is that me?
Is it me?
Oh no, I think it was.
I
me.
was muted, so it ain't me.
Here, let me try. I'm muting myself here.
I think it might have. Oh. Can you guys still hear me? That is beautifully clear. I think it was Matthew. Okay. All right. So now I sound like I don't hear anything at all. It sounds like an echo chamber. Okay. All right. So anyway, so that's the impression that I get, is that the preferred translation is without him not one thing was made. What was made in him was life. And I think that makes a lot of sense. You can see how some theologians would not like that as well, because some people could take that idea that what was made in him was life and take it in a theological direction. But then you can do that with all kinds of passages of Scripture, and people do anyway, so I don't have a problem with that. But anyway, so what has come into... Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I have a real problem with the philosophy of translation today anyway, because all of it involves a certain level of interpretation, and I think the NRSV does a pretty good job, the NASB and the ESV both do a good job, but even those have their ecclesiastical biases.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
well, you know,
I
you
just
can't,
wanted to throw that
you
in
can't
there.
avoid that. Let me have a brief aside here. So if you look at John chapter 4, John chapter 4 is one of my favorite examples of this, because what you have is this. Let me pull it up here. You have the woman at the well. So this is the Samaritan woman at the well, and Jesus approaches her, or actually she approaches the well, and Jesus is already chilling there. And then we enter into this discussion right here. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." Notice that phrase, living water. The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water?" Now, the interesting theory, are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well, etc.? The interesting thing here is that it's a little weird how she responds. So, with the translation as it stands, he says living water. To us, that's clearly a metaphor that means something not particularly relevant to the actual well and the water that's in the well. So why is it that she reacts to this thing that's to us clearly a metaphor, by saying, "You don't have a bucket and the well is deep. How are you going to get this living water for me?" Right? She's taking the phrase "living water" very literally. And so then it goes on. The woman said to him, he said, "Yeah, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that says you give me a drink, and you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She reacts to us strangely, and then Jesus replies, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I give them will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." Now we get something interesting. In our translation, as we have it, we see a play on words between the phrase living water and the phrase eternal life. Life springing up, gushing up like a spring. The water I will give them will become in them a spring of gushing water, water gushing up to eternal life. So we have a play of words. Now what you find out, culturally speaking, and this is what clarifies this whole passage, is that the term living water was a colloquialism in that culture that meant what we mean by our colloquialism, running water. So now things start to make sense. He is saying, give me some running water, only he's using the local colloquialism of living water, water that moves, it has it looks like it's alive. And so if a translator were to translate the colloquialism from living water into running water, then what you would have is, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that it is saying to you, "Give me a drink," you would have asked him, and he would have given you running water. And the woman says, "You have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get the running water?" Running water is clean water. It's not stagnated water. It makes sense that she's responding very, very, very materialistic, physically speaking. But if we translate it as running water, we entirely miss the play on words. And the play on words is the primary part of the meaning here. And so, we're trying to understand what Jesus is saying. So instead of translating it running water, translators make a deliberate choice to translate the words literally in order to highlight the play on words. So translators, therefore, are in a bind in this passage, where it's impossible for them to translate it fully, because they can't translate it both as both the play on words and the euphemism at the same time. So they take the one that is more meaningful and leave the other for commentaries and footnotes.
This is sorry to butt in for a second, but this is why I hold to Prima Scriptura rather than Sola Scriptura, just on account of there is so much underneath the physical translation that it requires extending beyond the physical sentences in order to get at the deepest meanings. And
right.
Yeah.
And this is why I say there's a little bit of a flaw in. I know the reformers wouldn't say only just you in the Bible, but in kind of pushing that so far, we've lost so much, and we need interpretation. We need mutual, we need research. We need mutual study and stuff like that. And just you in the Bible just doesn't cut it fully. You don't get as much meat.
Okay. I'm not going to be quiet any longer. You guys are talking about solo scriptura. That's what you're talking about, solo scriptura. There is no difference between Prima Scriptura and sola scriptura, properly understood. Most people who articulate sola scriptura are actually articulating solo scriptura. And the difference between the two is the doctrine of sola scriptura states that the Bible is the only standard, the only unchanging standard of doctrine and practice. That's the sum total of the doctrine. That doesn't mean that you neglect history. In fact, you kind of have to have history to understand the Bible properly. You have to have context, cultural context, linguistic context, all of those things. And nowhere does the Bible itself even say that it's the exclusive revelation. It's just the only unchanging standard. You get what I'm saying? That's all that sola scriptura means, is this the unchanging standard. But there's plenty of external revelation that's allowed by the doctrine.
Well, we get what you're saying, but it is one of those cases where the colloquial use of the term, like in pop theology, and especially if we're just really honest about ourselves, in a vast majority of low church Protestant, communities, it's kind of you almost have to use the term as a way of distinction and identity.
Well, yeah, and that's why I point out the term solo scriptura as opposed to the feminine sola scriptura. Solo scriptura has a necessary disagreement between the subject and the modifier, and what it's trying to convey there is it's just you and your Bible alone. The solo is applying to you and then scriptura, whereas sola scriptura is the Bible alone, not you and your Bible, the Bible alone, and as the standard. And I have to tell people that all the time. Anyway, go ahead, David.
I think solo scriptura is actually grammatically incorrect, but I think we get what you're meaning.
It is intentionally so. That's the point of it. It's a play. It's actually making fun of people who are just the me, myself, and my Bible thing.
Right. I'm not sure that I agree with you about how strong the difference is between sola and solo, but we have an upcoming broadcast on that subject, or the subject of Revelation in general, upcoming soon, I believe, based on the votes. And so I'll save my reflections on that because I have a lot on that subject.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
coming from a combination charismatic and Catholic, sort of background held together, there's a whole lot with
there is
revelation on my end, on top of the underlying philosophical.
If you see the comment on that post on the community page, where you can vote on the poll, the one comment that's the largest, because I didn't want to just use the word revelation because people's brains will stop there and not necessarily think through what all the different interesting subjects are. I went ahead and listed out a whole bunch of the interesting subjects, and it's by far the largest of the poll options.
I guess I hadn't seen it since then. I was going to say that, David, one time I posted a long comment that, I think it was a comment of yours originally, but it was like going into all of like the difficulties of translation and stuff like that. And anyway, I kind of reproduced that in a certain group, and then I said, I think it was this thread, thinking of that, I was saying something about how I'm more Prima Scriptura, and then like Jenna Featherstone, some of you know her, like gave this this link that was like, it was an old document that had been, reproduced on the internet, and it was like something about defining what sola scriptura means, and there was this technical term that apparently made the difference between Prima Scriptura and sola scriptura not that material, and I was like, huh, I guess it's not as great as I thought, but I'd have to go back and look at it again. But
it's probably not that great, but the use of the term Prima Scriptura for me serves, two ends, one aesthetic. Because I like the term prima, and but it does serve an identity, position, that kind of purpose, in that it does put me squarely into at least the lower C Catholic kind of way of it, which is that I can include more into prima while having the function of sola. So, whereas sola tends to have the baggage. So there is advantage, at least for me, in using the term Prima Scriptura, even if it is functional sola scriptura.
I think that any one of those has a tendency to trip us up and give us the impression that we're more objective than we really are. And so we're, espousing the idea of sola or solo or prima, and the whole time we think we're being quite objective about it, and this is quote unquote the objective truth. Full stop. This thing that I'm saying, this opinion on this passage, this interpretation, this translation, whatever. And I think that by using terms like that, we can get it. I understand the concept, and I don't absolutely disagree with the concept behind it, but the use of it can become a mire, and that sort of approach kind of is also why I have.
Sorry, I was just going to say this is why I framed it as, first, there's the aesthetic thing, and then it's an identity position purpose, rather than objectively making myself, like, aha, this is the way. But,
okay, so let's get back. Save this very large discussion for another time. So getting our heads back into John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, etc. What has come into being in him was life, and life was the light of all people, the phos. In Greek, it's the word phos. So the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Now, and that translation there is kind of iffy. If you'll actually compare the 15 most popular translations, you'll find a lot of variation on that last clause. The darkness did not overcome it. The darkness did not comprehend it. The darkness didn't grasp it, didn't understand it. I mean, there's several different ways of handling that, and so we have to be aware of that. It's not necessarily the darkness did not overcome it. It's not necessarily didn't comprehend it either. So we have some ambiguity there. Moving on.
I would definitely translate that as take hold of it, grasp it. Take hold of it as in to possess it, understand it, and use it for its own ends. That's how I've seen that.
According to like the Strong's definition, like you have kata, which is down, something like that, and then lambano, which is like to aggressively take. So it's kind of like it did not down violence it. I mean, as it were. So maybe that's a way of approaching it. Like it did not violence it down.
Yeah, there are a few different words we even have that kind of like our Venn diagram with both taking something and apprehend it. Like even apprehending, that's a word that can mean either you're taking something by force or you're comprehending or whatever.
And that's the thing is that our words apprehend and especially and comprehend even or grasp are words that are literally about grabbing something, but metaphorically about understanding. And the same thing is happening with the Greek term. And so it's hard to say which exact meaning is there. But then on top of that, we have this alternate alternate metaphor for the word katalambano, and that is to overcome. So you have these sort of three different ways of potentially understanding this passage just from the linguistic side of it. So we might be able to come up with a narrative solution to what probably this word should be understood as. But linguistically speaking, we have three pretty much distinct possibilities: understanding, grasping, possessing, handling, manipulating even, and then overcoming.
I think that a lot of problems would be solved linguistically if people just thought of language as being three-dimensional anyway. I mean, when you think of language as being flat, in any sense, you find you don't get a lot of what's actually going on and what people are saying. But when you three-dimensionalize language, you get the truth at some point, even if it's a whole bunch of them. So all at once.
Yeah, and just a brief note about the Strongs, and I'm not criticizing your use of the Strongs because you used it well. but Strong's is not a very good resource. It for the most
It was just
part
what was available. I mean,
yes,
honestly.
and it's very available, and it's useful for things like identifying other passages that use a particular Greek term, what it does semantically speaking is it primarily only shows you the translations that have been popularly used. It doesn't show you the full semantic range of an actual term objectively in the Greek language. It shows you the way that term has been translated in Scripture, and that can be a problem, especially if the traditional translations of a passage of a particular word aren't necessarily the best way of rendering it.
Well, that's why if I'm doing a deep study, or trying to give a deep argument, rather than just like right now, just looking it up in a dictionary in general. That's kind of what it is. It is Webster's, or for all intents and purposes, it is Bible Webster's.
Yeah, but it's only self-referential, so it's referential back to the way that it's been used, or the way it's been interpreted as being used in these books, rather than in the culture at large, which is why I like to use online resources like Perseus for looking up terms more broadly.
I usually do like an etymological study, which is I do it the long way around, unfortunately, when I'm doing a deep study like that. I haven't heard of Perseus, though. That might actually be a whole lot more. That might make my work more efficient.
It's a set of tools, and it will dig into, and it's useful because it doesn't only give you, as it were, glossary definitions, but it also gives you a number of example texts that you can see it even outside of Scripture. I'm sorry?
Can you link me that?
Yeah, I'll do that after the show. I can't really do it right now because my Chrome browser, for some reason, has stopped functioning. Maybe somebody else can pull it up. It's Perseus, and it's good for Greek in general, not just Koine Greek, which is the Greek of the New Testament. Okay, so moving on. Now, having gotten this first section out of the way, John moves on to there was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light, the true light, which enlightens everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, the true light, that is. Yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become the children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. Now, can somebody give us a brief retelling of Plato's cave?
Let's see.
Basically,
there's a man in dark. Justin, you got that.
Okay, well, there's basically these people who lived all their whole lives in the cave, and they're chained up, facing the wall. And the light is coming through the mouth.
We have an echo.
Okay, we got it.
Okay, so there's people who've been chained in the cave their whole lives, and they can't move, and they're just facing the cave wall, and the light's coming in through the mouth of the cave, and basically all they've seen their whole lives is a bunch of shadows playing on the wall, and they think that, because all they've ever seen is these shadows, they believe that this is reality. This is what reality consists of, is a bunch of shadows dancing around and moving and stuff. But then they, one of them is loose of his chains, and he gets up and he sees that all along behind them, these people and caravans or whatever are walking by, and they're casting these shadows, and that's what's creating the shadows. It's not they're not subsisting in it themselves. They're cast by the negation of the light that they create by obstructing it. And then he goes outside the cave, and then he sees that outside the cave it's full of light because the sun is giving light, and it's radiating everywhere. And so far from being just a bunch of shadows, life is so much more wondrous and glorious, basically.
Yeah, it was basically his way of saying that everything that we think is real is just a semblance of reality, and coming face to face with actual reality is a traumatic experience that most of us just simply aren't ready for and will actively fight to avoid.
Yeah, so if you, I would recommend you guys to read the two other allegories that immediately precede the allegory of the cave in Plato's what's the book? It's the book we're talking. The Republic is where this occurs. So you have the metaphor of you have the analogy of the sun, I believe it's called, and then following that you have the analogy of the undivided line, and then you have the analogy of the cave. I haven't yet read the undivided line, but this series of allegories is actually a response to a question. So the context is that in the narrative, Plato has set up this conversation between his teacher Socrates and Plato's older brother, and the older brother asks Socrates, "What is good? What is the good? Capital G. What is goodness?" Right? And so in response to this question, what is goodness, Socrates responds with this series of three... Oh, big echo. There you go. Plato responds with this... Socrates responds with this series of three allegories: the analogy of the sun, the undivided line, and the cave. And so he uses the sun. Now, there's some debate about this, because some people think that the whole thing is a political allegory. But probably most scholars would agree that the sun stands for goodness. And the light of the sun, the sunlight, is how we interpret the rest of the world, and that we can only interpret the rest of the world through goodness. We can only properly see reality through the eyes of goodness. And so that's the context here. All right? And so, of course, it's built on the backdrop of all of the other Platonic thoughts, like the Logos, for example. And so we have a lot of wind again. Is that you, Matthew?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's where I've been talking here.
That's all right.
Break the wind.
Okay. Yeah. Break it. Wah. So we have this whole background in Platonic philosophy of the Logos and the forms and all of these things, but also we have the supremacy of the good, the goodness. And so that's the subject that Plato is addressing in this dialogue between Socrates and Plato's older brother. And so now let's take that story and hold it in our mind as we go back to this passage again and look at the way that this is laid out. First, he begins with cosmogony, the origin of the universe, of reality as we know it, and he describes in the beginning was the Logos, the language of being, you might say, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life. And the life was, and this is where we get more overtly into what I think is the parallel to the cave, the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. There was a man sent from God. So in Plato's cave, you have this gentleman who gets freed from the chains one way or another, and he goes outside and he sees the sun, and he sees the sunlight, and his eyes finally adjust, and he understands. And then he comes back into the cave, and he tries to relate what he's seen through the light of goodness to the people who are still in chains. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not that light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light. Now this is where we get into another Greek term. The Greek word for true here that we see being used throughout the book of John is the word that in Platonic philosophy and a lot of Greek philosophy is the word which we would normally translate as the real. Are you guys familiar with this Greek concept of the real? Yeah? Okay. So that's the word that's being used as the modifier for light. The real light, which enlightens everyone, is coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world didn't know him, because we were all bound in chains and staring at the shadows. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become the children of God. And now, the children of God is not just a Hebrew concept. This is also a concept that you find in Greek philosophy independent of Hebrew culture. So you have this concept of the sons of God, you have this, and you have demigods, and this is not a foreign idea. So when John introduces the concept of Jesus being the Son of God, this isn't just a Hebrewism that he's importing in. He's also calling on a lot of cultural, background and a fascination with the concept. I mean, in fact, with Caesar worship, they believed that, that the Caesar was the Son of God, and this didn't have any ring of Hebrew culture to it at all.
Well,
So,
actually, I want to interject real quick to say that actually they did have the term "sons of God" in the Old Testament, and it did refer to divine beings. If you look at the
sure. No, I'm saying it's not a Hebrewism. I'm saying that it's a Hebrewism for the Hebrews, but the Hebrew use of it sprung up independently of the Greek use of it. They both use that.
It's a cultural universal. It's not just distinct to Judaism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So he's not completely divorcing from the Greek culture when he yet in his train of thought when he brings this up, and so I think a lot of us would probably think that he is already. Now, in background of this is that the reason why I began trying to I've been struggling with the prologue of John for a long time because there was a series of things that didn't make sense to me, didn't sync. Like, for example, the pleonasm in verse 3, all things were made, nothing was made without him that was made, etc. That was the first thing. But then why is he flip-flopping between all of these different metaphors? Why does he use the metaphor of the word and then goes into the metaphor of life and then the metaphor of light and then the children of God, the Son of God, and all of these, and then the Lamb towards the end? And so that's what basically started me on this sort of long-term journey of just struggling with what's the point here? What is he just being that schizophrenic and using all these different metaphors, or is there some deeper contextual meaning that he's trying to draw upon? And so that's where I think that Plato's cave comes into being. So the light, the true light, was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become the children of God, who were born. And also the translation of that word power there is potentially questionable. You have power, it can mean authority, it can mean capacity, and I think that's probably what the meaning is.
I read it as being right, having the right to call yourself the Son of God.
That's one of the popular translations. I have issues with the concept of rights, but I think ultimately that's a valid interpretation of it. I like to think of this as the capacity.
I think all capacity, authority, and the right.
So, but there's this idea of the becoming. So, of whatever it is, all who receive the light, who see things in terms of the light of goodness, who believe in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of man, but of God. And so there's a transformative thing that he's pulling on, and this is where he starts to bring the Greek metaphor into his own and reinterpreting it, and the logos. And this is where a lot of Greek people would go, whoa, the logos became flesh. Especially the part of Greek culture that was like, hey, dude, the material world is totally evil, and it's the spiritual world, the metaphysical world, that's totally good. So the Gnostics would go, "Whoa, dude, the Logos became flesh. What's up?" So this is the first place where he's overtly interacting with that Gnostic idea. But it's not just a Gnostic idea that he's interacting with; it's also Epicurean, etc. So the word, the Logos, the language of being, became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory, of course, has deliberate overtones of light shining. The glory of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. And this, by the way, and we've talked about this off air on a number of occasions, but the Father's only Son, it's an interesting idea. And to a Greek mind, they're thinking of Zeus. And a lot of Christians would have a problem with this. Why is John so far has not said anything that deliberately divorces from the Greek mind the concept of the Hebrew God, of Yahweh, from what would have immediately have come to their mind, which is probably Zeus, in some cases maybe Apollo, or others. But the interesting thing that you find when you look into a lot of the Greek literature is that a lot of these guys, these Greek guys, right? Like if you look at Marcus Aurelius, if you look at Cleanthe's hymn to Zeus, they are very much describing, they're describing God monotheistically in terms in which Christians would find themselves actually very comfortable. They hold a character to Zeus. They believe that Zeus, or Apollo in some cases, that's the term that they use for the creator God who's in control of everything, watching everything, who loves everyone, who's the origin of being, who has a innately good character, who cares about justice, who's concerned about us, watching over us in a fatherly way. So the Greek culture wasn't entirely devoid of the truth. They didn't have it in Jewish terms, but there were a lot of people who actually believed in something very substantially similar to the Judeo-Christian God. And now they may have also talked about other gods, but these kinds of people, they talked about other gods in a lesser sense, a sense of lesser gods, in much the same way that we might talk about angels or character attributes of the one God.
Classical
so if you look up, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, it's basic classical theism, and that's what Paul's point was on the in Athens. And also the unknown God, and he quoted their poets. They were the poem he was quoting from was actually talking about Zeus. Like in him we live and move our being, and we are his offspring and stuff like that. And Justin Martyr drew on that a lot too, when he was talking about how like even your Greek philosophers and poets talk about Zeus in this way, so he was kind of trying to bridge that gap and give them a testimony from their own culture. Probably similar to what Paul wrote about in Romans 1. Like God is evident from nature and all that.
All right. So you have 300 to 350 years before Christ, you have Cleanthe's, and I'm just going to briefly quote a part of Cleanthe's hymn to Zeus. O God most glorious, called by many a name, nature's great king through endless years the same, omnipotence who by your just decree controls all, hail Zeus, for unto you must your creatures in all lands call. We are your children, we alone of all on earth's broad ways that wander to and fro, bearing your image wheresoever we go. Wherefore with songs of praise your power I will proclaim. Look, yonder heaven that round the earth is wheeled, which, by the way, is an expression of Earth being a sphere, not a flat land. This is an old glimpse into Greek science as well. Yonder heaven that round the earth is wheeled follows your guidance. Still to you does yield glad homage. Your unconquerable hand, such flaming minister, the heftless brand, wields a sword two-edged, whose deathless might pulsates through all that nature brings to light. Vehicle of the universal word that flows through all, and in the light celestial glows of stars both great and small. A king of kings, through ceaseless ages, God whose purpose brings to birth whatever on land or in sea is wrought. or in high heaven's immensity, save what the sinner works infatuate. No, but you know how to make the crooked straight. Chaos to you is order in your eyes. The unloved is lovely, who did harmonize things evil with things good, that there should be one word through all things everlastingly. One word, whose voice, alas, the wicked spurn, insatiate for the good their spirits yearn. Yet seeing, see not, neither hearing, hear God's universal law, which those revere, by reason guided, happiness who win. The rest, unreasoning, diverse shapes of sin, self-prompted follow. For an idle name, vainly they wrestle in the contests of fame. Others inordinately riches court, or dissolute the joys of flesh pursue. Now here, now there they wander fruitless still, forever seeking good and finding ill. Zeus the all-bountiful, whom darkness shrouds, whose lightning lightens in the thunderclouds, your children save from error's deadly sway. Turn you the darkness from their souls away. Vouchsafe that unto knowledge they attain. For you by knowledge are made strong to reign over all, and all things rule righteously. So by you honored, we will honor thee, praising your works continually with songs, as mortals should, nor higher reward belongs, even to the gods, than justly to adore thy universal law forever. Now, does that not sound very Christian if it weren't for the use of the name Zeus?
Oh yeah, that's amazing.
I would have probably thought, if I were ignorant, that it was plucked straight from the Psalms. I mean, the language is a bit different than the Hebrew usage, but if it is, I would even think that it was pulled straight from like an old Christian hymn book.
Gives you a whole new perspective on that episode at Mars Hill where Paul talks about the unknown God.
There was there was a lot of common ground. I mean, judging from the notions of it. My response to that is like I feel like I should, because I've wanted to before, look deeper into like a kind of an unbiased treatment of what classical religion actually held.
Hey, I was fighting the urge to say amen the whole time.
I mean, it is very beautifully written.
It's beautiful.
For it. It brings to question to me, like, okay, so there has to
this was a Stoic
classical religion. There has to have been a caricature of classical religion that is being approached by a lot of its implicit opponents. Not necessarily like in the early Christian faith, but in the modern sense.
Can you restate that?
There has to be a caricature of classical religion that, like the way that moderns treat classical religion, that I feel, because religion has always been a whole lot deeper than its superficial, like, presentations.
Dude, the Catholics have been in the business of like totally defrauding people of history for 1600 years.
I don't think that's the case.
It is. It very much is. You know, old maxim. The old maxim goes that the winners of the wars write history, and there's been no greater devastating war ever in the history of this earth than the war amidst the Christianity that's manifested as Catholicism. It's what inspired the Inquisition. It's what inspired the convert or die attitude when they came to the Americas. I mean, all of this stuff. And one of the biggest things that Catholics did is they would take pagan traditions, they would take pagan holidays and pagan ceremonies. They put the Christian seal of approval on them and rewrite the terminology so it was pointing to Christ. And they would completely bury the origin of it. They would like burn the books. They would kill anyone who was actually a part of the culture from which they got it. What are you laughing about, Justin? Like you don't know this isn't true?
I need footnoted research on this and bound and put on my desk by morning.
Oh, shut up, George.
Yeah, we want a full essay on this matter.
I will say that there is a lot of truth to that, but that's also reductionistic. one of the huge things that people tend to forget is just how immense the fall of Rome was. The fall of Rome was like an enormous Great Depression. It was a Great Depression for the entire world, and it caused so much historical backlash to the extent to where the leaders of Rome, just, like 50 years after the fall of Rome, couldn't even find people who were skilled in the making of sculptures like they had 50 years before. That's how immense the cultural destruction was, just the fall of Rome. Christianity had nothing to do with that. Catholicism had nothing to do with that. It was a whole confluence of events that came together, and then Rome collapsed, Alexandria burned, and we lost a huge amount of the cultural history of the world at that time. And then what happened is that in just a generation, we started getting back on our feet and couldn't regain most of that knowledge. I mean, we recently discovered in a boat on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea a calculator, an early computer that could calculate the positions of the stars in the heavens and the planets 300 years in advance, accurately. It looked like a sort of a weird giant typewriter, and it was mechanical.
It was actually a Bronze Age thing. It was a lot older than 300 years.
I mean, even then, honestly, the Catholic Church rescued a great deal of what it did amidst the cultural turmoil. I mean, just looking at the architecture alone, rescued much of the Greek and Roman skills. And you have the literature. I mean, we physically have the literature. We have Aristotle's work. I mean, at least the copies of it. We have Plato's work and these things that were copied and all of that. So, I mean, even amidst the human imperfection, and the Inquisition wasn't that bad, I'll be honest.
Well, so.
Oh my goodness.
You had things like basically when Augustine went and said, we're going to redeem a lot of this Greek thought. Just the fact that Augustine became so popular saved a lot of that literature for us.
Wait. Augustine was one of the biggest opponents to including Greek thought. What really drew the difference between him and Aquinas, was that Aquinas was very inclusive and Augustine was very exclusive in that regard.
Well, but he spent an awful lot of time drawing on them.
Centuries after Augustine.
I didn't hear what either one of you said.
You first. I'm sorry. I keep interrupting. My social filter has just been blown out because of this week. I mean,
it's because I'm poking at your sacred cow, the Catholic Church.
No, actually, it's because I work at Walmart. I mean, so.
Amen.
That'll do it.
I feel you. Well, but then what happened is what happens with any culture if you go through an event of that magnitude or even close to that magnitude? What happened after the Great Depression in America? Immediately after the Great Depression in America, the culture constricted around itself, became extremely conservative. And because the conservative tendency is a reaction to anxiety, it's a desire to protect, to conserve.
I'm having a hard time understanding the historical context because the fall of Rome, there's many different events that are called that, and the way I've read history is it's more of a gradual decline, and the Rome itself, the city itself fell, but the Roman Empire actually existed up until the late Middle Ages in the form of the Byzantine Empire. So
right.
what time period are you talking about specifically?
Well, so the Catholic Church came in to help sustain the empire.
Yeah, about 6th, 7th century.
But long before that, like the financial system and things collapsed, and so this came about just before the Catholic Church started really locking down on theology. And so this very conservative reaction to dissenting opinions happened immediately following what I'm calling the fall of Rome, the classical fall of Rome. And so I think that this was the conservative reaction to all of this impending fear of, you have the culture just sort of collapsing around us, and
So,
we're all very afraid.
You talking about the 6th, 7th century, somewhere around there?
What is it? You know, the time period I'm not. It began well before that, and so there was clearly a period of time where this became more and more true.
Yeah, well, that's why I called it a decline, and I'm trying to nail down, because there was some very distinctive phases that the world and the empire itself went through throughout all of this, and it's what basically produced Roman Catholicism. If you look at it hard enough, you'll see that Roman Catholicism is state-sponsored religion. They appropriated Christianity for themselves. But as far as the cultural decline, the economic decline, and all of that stuff, that happened shortly after Constantine. What was that, like 4th, 5th century?
Yeah, it was really early. So what I'm saying is that as that's happening, the cultural response to that is conserving what and that means, you know, becoming conservative means systematizing, becoming stricter, and this is when you see the Catholic Church starting to really get serious about hammering down on the concept of orthodoxy and heresy, and then you end up with a series of events where the Catholic Church is, because the Catholic Church is an immense thing, it's hard to put it in a box. It's doing a lot of positive things in restoring culture and bringing the West back to a place where they're educated in things. But then there's also a lot of elements in the Catholic Church that are doing a lot of negative things because of that conservative tendency, destroying other cultures and destroying evidence of the past and destroying evidence of their own misdeeds.
Well, okay, wait. We need to be clear. We need to differentiate. There are factions within the Catholic Church. So
yes, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely. And so I want to make it very clear that there were some very academic, intellectual factions, but the overall leadership seated in Rome traditionally has been very anti-intellectual, very authoritarian, very what's that? Magisterium. It's all about the magisterium.
Magisterial. Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with you on that. But yes. So anyway, so this is really off topic. But so in fact, I'm not even sure how we got to this subject. But
we're the wandering wanderers.
That's right.
I wake up at 6 hours. So.
Hey, Justin, I have a question. Do you remember what that documentary was on the Catholic Church and building?
Oh, How the Catholic Church Saved Civilization.
Yeah.
Thomas
You need to link Eric that.
Yeah.
I've seen it. I've seen it. I know.
You need to read it again and watch it again.
Listen. You guys think that I'm just a typical Baptist who hates Catholics and stuff. I actually flirted with the Catholic Church for a while. Half my family, my grandmother went to Catholic school. I know an awful lot about Catholic history, and even today, most Catholics, higher up Catholics, will admit they have a very dark history. And yes, it has been very anti-intellectual, anti-science, all of that stuff. Now the Jesuits were different. They pursued some intellectual stuff. Same thing. You get the secret society.
I just find that the negatives are being a bit exaggerated.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially in light of that the rhetoric sounds far too similar to Dark Age mythicists and such.
Well,
you
can talk about the Catholic Church saving civilization, but they're the ones who burned Alexandria.
No,
they're not.
This was a political thing. It wasn't like they're anti-intellectual, and so they burned down the Alexandria.
No. They weren't anti-intellectual for just that sake.
They had a mob people.
They didn't
according
want people
to the story.
They didn't want people being educated because they didn't want people to have that power. They did not want people to be empowered. It was a very authoritarian-based hierarchy, and it was very corrupted because, power corrupts.
It was a mob of people, at least from the story, that burned down Alexandria. And I think Alexandria was already in decline as it was.
Yeah, they were. What I'm saying is
that it wasn't even really at its glory, and it was all over. It's like a local church having a tiff. It's not the Bishop of Rome marching
down. The Roman
down
Catholic Church has banned more books than any singular man entity ever. Okay, the Roman Catholic Church has banned and burned more books.
Oh, right. Let's get on topic.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to say that because
just
you
want these
guys have
sources
this
cited.
assumption. You have this assumption, and I haven't heard any sources from you guys either, so whatever. But you have this
Everyone making
assumption
positive claims.
of a nobility. Yeah, I'm making positive claims that are pretty universally accepted. You guys are one of the rare few.
Oh, come on.
Even Michael Tabor agrees with me, and he's a friggin' Catholic.
Michael who?
Michael Tabor, he's on my friends list. You probably don't interact with him much because he's not a
I
very
know
serious
Catholics
debater.
that would be very peeved off of what you're saying.
Anyway, all I'm saying
I think
is
you're
that
just.
you
I'm
guys
just saying that the
are
emphasis.
biased on the other side of it. That's
Okay.
all I was trying to say.
Hey, Megan.
I am hoping to be confirmed as an Episcopal, so it's not that I'm it's not that I've crossed the Tiber, but it's that I kind of want a little bit more substance on this matter.
Yeah, exactly.
I need a gavel.
Oh, okay.
Oh, we need to do a show in church history. Is all it is. But I gotta go. I have 6 hours sleep. So.
All right. You have a good night, Justin.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Lots of hearts.
Get a bookshelf.